are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your co-hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, great to be back with you.
Eugene, the pleasure is all mine.
Oh, I like we're bringing that back. Thank you.
Yeah.
But I think, well, you know what? Let me not even try to extend that analogy. This could get weird quickly. So let's just say I'm happy to be here with you, as always. Got a great show for folks, as always. So as we always do, wow, I'm saying a lot of always is here. This is a great time if you are, however you can do it, smoke signal, carrier pigeon, phone call, text message. Let folks who are following you follow us by letting them know that we are live right now on the Freedom Side on YouTube. And for those of you who are already here, also just want to remind you that you can and you should hit the subscribe button so that you're following our channel, and hit the bell so you can get the alerts about all the fantastic content coming out here on Breakthrough News, including, of course, Dispatches with Rania Khalek. Had some very interesting ones recently. Ali Abunimah was fantastic.
Well, thank you.
Yes. No, I mean, as always. I mean, they're always good, but yeah, he's brought a great energy to it. Shout out to the whole Electronic Intifada crew, by the way. It does a lot to support us here at Breakthrough. So yes, subscribe, hit the bell, get the alerts, let people know that you can watch us right now live on YouTube. And yeah, those are most of our reminders, Rania.
Well, and then of course, if you want to support us on a more regular basis, go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a patron. And of course, the other ways you can support us, you can donate below on YouTube on many of our videos, as you'll notice. And of course, make sure you follow the show. Make sure, like Eugene said, hit the bell so you get notifications. Send it to everyone you know.
Yes.
That way we get more subscribers, and it helps us beat the algorithm.
Oh, wow.
That works.
I didn't even know that. Look at that. Well, that's important. We are all beholden to the algorithmic gods, fairly or unfairly. But listen, it's like the old Norse gods, Rania. Sometimes they shine on you, sometimes they don't.
I feel like, the independent media is so much more important than ever because, I mean, this, I know you're going to bring in our first guest shortly. And this is a good segue to that, is the fact that the environment is just so freaking hawkish right now, all across like mainstream institutions, all across Washington, D.C. And you could tell by the reaction to the Progressive Caucus letter from the entire media, and as well as like the entire pundit class. So that's another reason to support Breakthrough, because I feel like we're really one of a handful of places where we talk about the taboo issue of peace and diplomacy.
Yes,
which is crazy.
Amazing that it is taboo, amazing that this is even the world we're living in, but I think a very good point about the importance of all independent alternative media outlets who are, pushing for the good things in the world. And that is a great segue into discussing some of these issues around negotiations, Ukraine, the politics of the U.S. Congress. And for this discussion, we are very honored to be joined by Medea Benjamin, who is a co-founder of Code Pink and author of the recently released War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Medea, thank you so much for being back with us.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Eugene and Rania. I can almost feel like a sigh of relief just being on with you as opposed to other shows I've been on in the last 2 days.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And I know you've been on a tour, too, of the country as well, talking about this with all sorts of different people. And I guess I'm just curious, Medea, to start of what you're making of the fact that the sort of first glimmer of progressive opposition to the war in Ukraine and looking for peace talks was just kind of so quickly shut down in both the discourse and the political conversation.
I think we're living in crazy land here in the United States. I mean, I never thought I would be in a position to see how the call for diplomacy is treated as heresy, as treacherous, as giving in to Putin, as not supporting Ukraine. It's just amazing that they are so fearful of any dissent within the Democratic Party. And I probably shouldn't even use that word dissent, because that letter, if you read that letter, that was the mildest of letters. It started out with all kinds of praise for Biden, how great he's been, how Congress has been so supportive, giving military aid. And then it merely said, we should pair that with proactive diplomacy. That's all it said. And I am so naive that when that letter first came out, I thought, oh, you're going to get every member of the Democratic Party to sign that. I knew it wouldn't be Republicans because of all the praise for Biden, but I thought, who's going to object to that? Boy, was I wrong.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, it's really stunning, right? Because the letters also expressed support for, like you mentioned, it praised the Biden administration's policy, expressed support for continuing to militarily support Ukraine. It just very lightly called for prioritizing some measure of diplomacy, particularly given the stakes with this war, in the sense that we're talking about potential for nuclear escalation, which, isn't being discussed enough. But then you had them retracted, right? Like first there was all this pressure and all this outrage against this letter, and then you had them retract it. And as a leader in Code Pink, Medea, you've been involved in many and in lobbying against many conflicts and trying to push for members of Congress. I'm sure you've probably worked with dealing with the Progressive Caucus before, when we're talking about places like Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, maybe parts of Latin America. So I'm curious, is this unprecedented? Like, were you surprised by this reaction? Is there a comparable conflict in which just the mere call for diplomacy provokes this level of intense pressure and outrage to the point where members of Congress are bullied into withdrawing it?
I've never seen anything like this before. I've never seen a letter signed by members of Congress that was signed, sealed, and delivered, and then withdrawn. That's really unprecedented. And I think it speaks volumes to the political situation in our country right now, where everything is about partisan politics, where you can't trust anybody in what they're saying. You have these right-wing Republicans calling for a cutoff in money to Ukraine, but, would they be doing it if Trump were in the White House? I doubt it. And now you have these Democrats who tip their toe into a sane pond, calling for talks when even the private conversations in the White House and the Pentagon are saying that there is no winning in Ukraine. And the whole of the Democratic establishment came down on them. We even saw members who signed the letter balking and saying, take my name off of that. I would have never signed. I signed back in the summer months when it looked like Ukraine wasn't doing so good, but now they're about to win, and so I wouldn't have signed it now. All kinds of things coming from conservative to progressive Democrats that I just find very, very dangerous at this moment.
One of the things that I'm wondering, just sort of your thoughts on sort of taking away from this is, how much does this speak to the power of, the sort of permanent military industrial war complex in these sorts of situations, whereby it seems, everything is so centered around this drive to war, and no matter what you can do, no matter what people do, no matter what the situation is, it just seems like reality is just pushed to the side. It just feels like there has to be some force that is pushing here for this kind of lockstep reality without any sort of conversation.
Yes, I certainly think it shows the power of this military-industrial congressional complex that is always looking for another war. And when we wound down the war in Afghanistan, well, lo and behold, there was Ukraine. And, while there are members of the right-wing Republican Party that are calling to stop the blank check to Ukraine, many of them are saying our real adversary is China.
Right.
So we have two war parties in the pockets of the weapons companies that make billions and billions of dollars from this conflict.
And then the other aspect of this that was quite disappointing was it didn't surprise me to see certain members of Congress immediately capitulate to this kind of pressure from these various forces that we're discussing, military, industrial complex, weapons companies. I'm sure there was lots of phone calls received, not to mention the sort of media firestorm that was created around this letter. But it was also striking to me to see how even the most progressive members of Congress, right, were very much against this letter and expressing outrage about their names being on this letter. And then you had, and this made me really sad, you had Bernie Sanders come out and say he didn't support this letter. And to me, it just suggests, there's not even a single person in either Congress or the Senate, not even one person that's willing to put their name on the issue of diplomacy. I mean, what does that say about where we're at? It goes to what you're talking about, where we don't have any real representation in Congress. But I mean, even if you poll the American public, the majority of people, if I'm not mistaken, are actually for some sort of negotiation and diplomatic solution to this conflict. So what does it say when even the people who run as, oh, I'm on the left, I'm anti-war, who've even used the term anti-imperialism before, aren't even able to put, to use those words now with respect to this conflict? Does it speak to, because at the end of the day, I know these are just politicians, right? And there's nobody maybe in their base pushing them enough. But what does it say about the anti-war movement? What does it say about the left? What can we be doing to be pushing our members of Congress and be pushing this conversation in the direction it needs to go in?
Well, let's remember there are members of Congress, 57 Republicans in the House and 11 in the Senate, who did vote against the $40 billion. It was just that there was not one Democrat. And yes, it's been very sad to see that out of a progressive caucus of 100, they only got 30 to sign. And then those 30, one by one, were saying, take my name off. And that includes Jamie Raskin, Sarah Jacobs. It includes Ilhan Omar. And yes, Bernie Sanders, I went to his office and met with his aide, and they said, and I said, can't we get a similar letter like this in the Senate? And he looked at me and he said, that letter is tone deaf. You can't talk to Putin. And I think that is such an irrational position to hold. So what can we do? Yes, it speaks that we need a much stronger movement. There have been groups that have been meeting with their members of Congress, calling for precisely diplomacy and calling on them not to vote for an upcoming package of $50 billion that it looks like they're trying to ram through Congress in this lame duck session. And I've been going around the country with this new book on a 50-city speaking tour. And it's been fascinating because I've been meeting at these talks not just people who self-identify as progressives, Democrats, to the left of the Democrats, socialists, but also people who are libertarians and even Trump supporters. So there is the possibility of a broad tent of people, especially as recession sets in and people are going to be asking more and more, why are we giving over $100 billion to Ukraine when I can't pay my energy bills? When look at the price of food in the grocery store, and the price at the pump is going to be going up again. So I think we will see a lot more people questioning this and calling for talks.
Mm-hmm. And just a reminder to folks, that book is War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, Medea Benjamin and Nick Davies from OR Books. And I'm glad you brought up the story from Bernie Sanders' office, because I feel that is such a key element of this whole thing is the idea that negotiating with someone somehow implies some level of support. And I feel, I've been dealing with anti-war issues since the first Iraq War. You can't negotiate with Saddam. You can't negotiate with the Taliban. You can't negotiate with Putin. And it's always this sort of piece. And I wonder how you respond when people put that in front of you, because I think that is sort of a thing that scares a lot of people, because they think calling for negotiations means that they now have endorsed the entire program of Vladimir Putin.
I say that wars almost always end at the negotiating table, and that we have to try. that if you think that you can't negotiate, well, let us see what happens when negotiations are initiated. I talk about what happened at the end of March when Turkey was mediating talks and there was a 15-point plan on the table, but that was scuttled not by Ukraine or Russia, but by the UK and the US deciding to move the goalpost and say it was no longer about ending the war, but about weakening Russia. And then I also say that there have been successful talks on particular things, like getting the international inspectors into the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, or getting the thousands of tons of grain from Ukraine out into countries that desperately need it, or the 17, by my calculation, prisoner swaps that have happened. So that shows that they can talk. It just means that there has to be talks not only between Ukraine and Russia, but there have to be talks between Russia and the United States. And Sergei Lavrov from Russia suggested that Putin and Biden could talk at the upcoming G20 meeting in Indonesia. And the Secretary of State Blinken just brushed that off as a sign of posturing. Well, I say we want you to call their bluff if indeed you think it's a bluff and start meeting.
You know, Medea, I think that what's, so disturbing about this particular conflict, not that other conflicts aren't disturbing, because with every war comes, atrocities and human suffering, in very extreme ways. But in this case, the stakes are so high because of the issue of potential nuclear escalation. And you have officials in Washington really very cavalierly talking about nuclear retaliation and escalation like it's no big deal. And so can you just talk about what's at stake here and why it's so important? Because I feel like it's really not emphasized enough. And in fact, when it is emphasized in the media, what we keep hearing is that, oh, well, if we actually sit down and negotiate with Putin, it actually makes nuclear war more likely, which is just completely illogical to me. So I don't know. What do you say about that?
Well, I think it's a good time to get people to reflect on what happened 60 years ago exactly, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was a time when nuclear Armageddon was a possibility. And we had two leaders, JFK and Khrushchev, who decided that they would talk to each other, communicate. And not only was the stand down attributed to the fact that the U.S. agreed it wouldn't attack Cuba and Russia withdrew its missiles, but there was more compromise, which was that the U.S. withdrew its missiles from Turkey. And a year later, when JFK was reflecting on that, he said, never put a nuclear power into a position where they have to choose between a humiliating retreat and the use of nuclear weapons. And that's what Biden is doing right now. So it's extremely dangerous. And yes, when you hear pundits cavalierly say, oh, well, the probability of the use of a nuclear weapon is maybe only 10 or 20%. I say 1% is unacceptable. And that's why we need to do everything that we can to force the leaders of all countries to find a solution. And that's why leaders from all over the world, whether it's Indonesia or South Africa or India, are all saying, we don't want to take sides in this. There's only one side we want to take, and that's the side of peace. You all need to find a solution.
Well, I know Code Pink is working at the grassroots here in the U.S. to raise the voice for peace. So for people who are watching Medea, how can they find your work and get engaged?
There's two ways. One is to go to our website, codepink.org, and the other is to go to the website called peaceinukraine.org, which is a coalition of groups around the country. We encourage you to join us because the only way we're going to see the Secretary of State meet with his counterpart in Russia or Putin meet with Biden is if we at the grassroots put more pressure on. And let's make sure we don't silence the voices, the very few voices in Congress who are calling for negotiations.
Well, once again, Medea Benjamin, author of War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, among other things. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much. Good being with you.
Well, Rania, I can only hope that we can get some glimmer of hope here in the negotiation front. Good to hear Medea's in 52 cities, and I think whatever we can do at the grassroots level, the support in the polls. I mean, you pointed out a majority of people, do want to negotiate. The number of people who are saying that the U.S. is doing too much for Ukraine is going up in terms of the polling that we're seeing. So obviously, the New York Times article about this exact issue is saying that there's war weariness and pointing to even though the letter was withdrawn, they said the fact that it even came out in conjunction with the Kevin McCarthy thing, that there are more people who really want to see a change here, but they really just don't have a voice in anyone in Congress, unfortunately. And hopefully some of those people will wake up to the extent the masses of people wake up. But, in the 80s, since we're talking about historical precedents here, there was a similar situation where the Reagan administration came in and was, bent on having a nuclear saber-rattling policy, and it awoke millions of people in this country, the largest demonstration to ever happen in the country, 1 million people in 1982 in Central Park in New York City against nuclear war. And it really changed the political equation, even though no one at that time in either political party was looking to address it. So, shows that people can change things if they want.
Yeah, and I really think that this falls on the media in so many ways, because people aren't even hearing that this is a positive. I mean, they hear the word nuclear war sometimes in nuclear escalation, but it's being blamed solely on Putin. He's a madman, so we have to do everything we can to get him to behave. And we have no responsibility or stake in this. And also the term, it's being played down like, oh, no, there's tactical nukes. They're just like small little bombs. It's no big deal. And it's just like, Jesus Christ, people.
And it's important you bring that up at the tactical nukes, because going back to the 1960s, this has been a major strategy of the people who are for nuclear war, is to try to play it down. There's a book, if people can dig it up. It's from 1983. It's long out of print by Bob Scheer, but it's called With Enough Shovels. And the title of the book is because there is this general, I'm laughing, this is not funny at all, to be honest with you, but there is this general in the Pentagon in the Reagan administration who, in an interview about the dangers of nuclear war, was like, well, we've studied the issue, and we found that if you dig a hole 6 feet deep in your backyard, and remember, 6 feet deep is how deep you dig a grave. But anyway, he's like, if you dig a hole 6 feet deep in your backyard and cover it up with a door, you can survive a nuclear attack. So with enough shovels, we're all going to make it. It's totally absurd. And the book really just goes into how absurd this is. But this is always a big thing. At one point, there was an attempt to make a nuclear weapon that was so small, you could fire it like a grenade from a gun. All these different efforts to try to make it seem like this is not going to destroy humanity, which it will. Jesus. I encourage folks to look at the International Red Cross reporting on that. Before we switch to our next guest, I want to shout out 2 anonymous donations and Jeff Adams for your donation. But talking about people power, we're going to switch gears to the elections in Brazil. A lot of people are going to be going to the polls there, tens of millions, and quite a bit for the nation of Brazil, of course, but also the region of Latin America, the entire world, really. There's a lot of changes potentially on the line here in this election coming up this Sunday. And we are very honored to be joined, as we always are, by Zoe Alexandra, journalist and co-editor of People's Dispatch, who is in Brazil, on the ground, in place. Zoe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, you have been in Brazil, I think, for several months now, basically for the entire campaign. First round of the election, which already took place. Former President Lula Ignacio da Silva was victorious, but it's gone to a second round because of the nature of their elections. For those of us who are watching closely from around the world, it seems like this last week has been very, very intense. But, maybe the first question I have for you, Zoe, is, what are the stakes of this election when we look at the two candidates side by side?
This has been said throughout the campaign, before the campaign started, that really what's at play in Brazil in these elections are 2 projects. One that is for the people, one that wants to create hope, that wants to have a future for the people of Brazil, the people of Latin America, and another project, which is a project of Jair Bolsonaro, which is a project of hatred, of fear, of death, of handing over Brazil's natural resources to international capitalists, of destroying the Amazon. So it's really, it's really down to that. It's down to a project of death versus a project of life.
And, Zoe, coming into the second round, we heard before the first round that Bolsonaro was trying to get people outraged that there was already good. That he was trying to prepare everyone for the idea of fraud and sort of set up a Donald Trump January 6th style situation in case Lula won in the first round. Obviously, Lula did extremely well, but it had to go on to a second round. Is that still happening? Is Bolsonaro still setting the stage for using these potential fraud claims to push for a coup of sorts? Or is that, does he think he actually has a chance to win? And so the situation's changed?
I think he's definitely worried about losing. I think all of the polls have indicated that he will lose. Of course, not to put all of our faith in the polls, but I think he also knows that an actual military coup, boots on the ground, maybe 20th century style, is actually not possible in Brazil. And there's a number of factors that kind of tell us that. First of all, Jair Bolsonaro is not very popular internationally right now, even though the Democrats are conservative and we're really not liberal or progressive at all. They still aren't going to back a coup in Brazil by the military. And in order for a coup to take place, you need the support of the United States, really, at the end of the day. Also, there's a big division amongst the bourgeoisie in Brazil. A lot of the bourgeoisie economic elites have actually supported the candidacy of Lula da Silva because of the destruction that Jair Bolsonaro has done to the Brazilian economy. The real has devalued significantly. Exports are down. The economy is really in ruins, and it's not just for the over 125 million people who are suffering from food insecurity, but it's also for middle class and upper middle class people who are not able to afford the same kinds of economic comforts that they were during the PT governments. So I think that's a huge factor. There's a divided bourgeoisie, no support of the United States for such an adventurous project. And at the end of the day, he doesn't really have the united support of the military. He doesn't have the united support of Brazilian society. Also, the way that Brazil is structured, it would actually, an attack on the capital, for example, like we saw in the United States on January 6th, would not logistically be possible. Everyone votes on election day and they're super far away and spread out. And then actually the swearing in, which would maybe be another big moment, is on January 1st, which is, of course, New Year's Day. So difficult to rally people. But at the end of the day, he's not really winning the information war with regards to electoral fraud. He doesn't have enough strength to actually, make that stand as an argument and to rally people behind it.
Zoe, I mean, it seems, almost everything in this election really turns on the votes of poor and working class people. Though we were there, you were with us in the first round. And, even Bolsonaro himself noted that he basically lost because he has no real support amongst the poor, amongst the working class, who, are disproportionately people of color, as we'd say here in the United States. And I know that he was saying he was going to re-up his ability or his attempts to really reach, those populations. I know he's giving out tons of money in cash, but I mean, I wonder your evaluation of his efforts and whether or not it seems as if they're bearing fruit or perhaps even backfiring.
Well, because as I mentioned, the economy is in such ruins here and that it's just such a dire situation. So many more people homeless, suffering from hunger, food insecurity, as I mentioned. You can't ignore the economic situation. And so Bolsonaro has also tried some strategic moves. There's the Auxílio Brasil program, which is an economic aid program. He strategically timed that so people would get their handouts right before the second round. But as you said, I think above all, the division of vote is on race line. There's the majority of Black and Indigenous people in this country are not voting for Jair Bolsonaro. You look at the map of Brazil, and you have been commenting on this, Eugene, but the northeast of Brazil is over 60% for Lula. They know exactly what the economic policies of the Workers' Party were able to do for this region that has been underdeveloped, ignored, and ridiculed really by far-right conservatives. Jair Bolsonaro himself and his supporters attacked the people of the Northeast and saying that they're stupid, that they're illiterate, and that's the only reason why they would support the Workers' Party. So there's a really big racial division in this election, of course, on class lines as well. Working class people are the most affected of what's been happening in Brazil for the past couple of years. The privatization of companies, the deindustrialization, millions of people have lost their jobs. Thousands of companies have been forced to shut. These are the people that are impacted by Jair Bolsonaro's ruling and governance, and he really has nothing to offer them besides the Workers' Party's demonic. They're going to shut your churches. They're going to make your kids gay. They have nothing actually concrete to offer them.
Yeah, which is, of course, in stark contrast to this massive coalition behind Lula. Can you tell us a little bit about who makes up that coalition?
Yeah, so the Coalition for Hope in Brazil is a very broad coalition. You have from the Communist Party of Brazil to the Party for Socialism and Liberation. You have some centrist parties as well. And after the first round elections, some of the other presidential candidates who are more in the center, Simon Tebet, who's a big environmental defender, but had very, very harsh criticisms of the Workers' Party. All of these people have joined into the Coalition of Hope. And beyond the political parties coming together, what's really interesting about this huge electoral force that's behind Lula and behind the Workers' Party in these elections is an immense number of cultural personalities. You have singers, most famously Anita, for example, many football players, so many people who are even not living in Brazil at this moment because of the situation, and seeing the importance of having a return to hope, having a return to possibility of the Brazilian people having a future. And I think that's what's so important in these elections is that, and why so many people are taking a stand and actually expressing their support for Lula. And it's always important to mention that these elections come after almost a decade of this very intense lawfare campaign against the Workers' Party, specifically against Lula da Silva himself. So the fact that people are able to kind of overcome these years, this decade of hate campaigns, of media campaigns that demonize him, where he's only depicted as a prisoner wearing a uniform, literally in all of the major magazine covers, I think is so crucial to underline that now today people are realizing, first of all, that that was a fraudulent campaign against him, but second of all, that Lula is the only leader right now that can actually bring all these diverse sectors together and give a possibility for change in Brazil.
You know, I think one of the important questions is continental, if you will, but also sort of worldwide. I mean, of course, Lula was a founder of the BRICS Alliance, a major player in CELAC, which is meeting right now, also Mercosur. I mean, really an advocate of, South-South cooperation, sort of multipolar worlds before that was a term, Latin American unification, all these different pieces. I'm curious what you're expecting. It's hard to say, I know, on that front, but I think that certainly, to have a figure of his stature back in the international arena is bound to have some repercussions.
Definitely. I think it's going to add an even greater weight to this progressive wave we're seeing across Latin America. And I know we've talked about it a lot on this show, but with the victory of Petro, with the victory of other progressive leaders, with the leadership of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Latin America is a different continent. And the victory of Lula in this context would mean huge possibilities for the region, for the continent. So many different proposals in terms of in the medical area, in science and technology, even in regional economy. There's so many possibilities. If, for example, Brazil recovers its state enterprise, strengthens Petrobras, strengthens Electrobras, this could mean huge tangible and material impacts to the countries of the region that really rely on Brazil for a lot of trade, that have a lot of economic relationships with it. And Lula has been very clear that he will favor Latin American integration. He will favor alliances like BRICS. And I think especially at this moment, when you see the BRICS alliance strengthening with many more countries interested in joining, this would be a serious impact on Latin America, but also the world.
And speaking of the impact on the world, I think one of the other major differences between these candidates, among many, that has world-altering consequences is their environmental policies. Can you talk a little bit about the stakes for the environment?
Yes, I mean, I think this is one of the most central issues at stake in these elections. Brasil de Fato did a really, really great report, and they had a map, essentially, of where major environmental crimes have been committed in the past 5 years. And this includes illegal mining, this includes burning of the rainforest, it includes logging that happens, and other such activities. And they placed that over a map of support for Bolsonaro versus Lula. And unsurprisingly, the biggest overlap was the areas of environmental crimes with support to Bolsonaro. He has essentially given a free hand to all of these land grabbers, illegal miners, to kill indigenous people, to steal land, to burn without any repercussions. And this has huge impacts on, of course, the surrounding communities. There's been an absolute genocide of the indigenous people in the Amazon in Brazil. So on the impacts on these communities, on the surrounding areas, the impact on Brazil, the impact on the rainfall that they're going to have, but also the impact of destroying the Amazon will have global consequences. And Jair Bolsonaro has called the protection of Amazon kind of like a cartel, that the protection of land by indigenous people is not necessary, that's overstated, that all of this is just a big conspiracy. And, he hasn't shown that he'll take a strong stand against people who are illegally committing these crimes of burning the Amazon, whereas you see all of the other candidates that were essentially running against him have said there should be zero illegal burning of the Amazon, zero illegal logging in the Amazon, understanding the importance of what the Amazon means for the world. And this kind of brazen destruction of the environment in favor of capital is just a clear, very obvious example of how the neoliberal capitalists of today's society are operating. Bolsonaro is, of course, an extreme example of it, and he really can't hide from this. But this is, of course, happening across the globe. And it's important that there are leaders who are going to prioritize protection of the environment, prioritize the protection of the communities that are really preserving the environment for the entire world, which the indigenous communities of the Amazon have been doing for decades.
Yeah, and some very notable indigenous representation coming into Congress this year. And while we're talking about some of the lower level elections, I know gubernatorial elections that are also in their second round are coming up. I know there's some big ones in Sao Paulo and Bahia, I think in Pernambuco, a few other places where that's a big factor in the sort of just broader push, in the election. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that second level, if you will.
Definitely. And it's huge. I think I'm, of course, speaking from the state of Sao Paulo. I was this morning with the government candidate for the state of Sao Paulo, Fernando Haddad, from the Workers' Party. He, of course, was the 2018 presidential candidate. And the race in Sao Paulo is of extreme importance to what happens in Brazil. Sao Paulo is the largest state in the country with the largest population, is what I mean. And it decides, of course, a lot of what happens in the country. In this race, we see Fernando Haddad of the Workers' Party going up against Tarcísio Freitas, who is, amongst other things, was part of the MINUSTAH mission to Haiti. He was one of the generals that oversaw this mission, important to mention, especially at this moment. He's a huge Bolsonaro supporter. He actually has only really lived in Rio de Janeiro. He's been essentially exported to Sao Paulo. And for many people, he represents the exportation of Bolsonarism for the state of Sao Paulo, with the intention of militarizing the city, is what happened in Rio, where you have a military operation on the ground in the city itself. Many other proposals, privatizing the water, for example, which Fernando Haddad has been campaigning heavily against, the state water company. And there's a lot of other nefarious proposals that would essentially alter the life of the people in Sao Paulo. And it's sort of a minor level example of this face-off between Lula and Bolsonaro, but in this case, it's Haddad and Tarcísio. It's a very important race. That's been extremely close. In the last poll, Haddad was behind Tarcísio by only 2 points. That could be interesting. I know in Pernambuco, there's two sort of centrist-leaning candidates. Both of them are supporting Lula, but it's going to be quite close as there. And, these are the governors, of course, in Brazil is a federal country. The governors do have some control over of the state politics. We saw in the pandemic that the governors played a huge political role in actually challenging Bolsonaro's policies on COVID confinement and other restrictions. So these are really, really important races as well. And, after this second round, we'll see the full kind of composition and layout of what Brazil is going to look like for the next 4 years. As we know, in the first round, there was a strong presence of conservatives in the Senate, in the Congress. So it's going to be definitely an interesting next 4 years.
No, absolutely. And I hope everyone is following People's Dispatch, which is going to bring you everything. I'm sorry we won't be able to revive our Instagram live like we were. We'll have to find another election to do that again. But obrigado, Zoe. As always, we really appreciate having you here on the show and breaking it all down for us.
Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. Thank you in Portuguese, Rania. Listen, I don't have that much, but I got a little.
I don't like when you talk in code, so I'm glad that you clarified that for me.
Listen, I'm trying to have a little cultural competency here, just a little bit. Amazing stuff. I also want to shout out Matt here, who's helping us on this show, but all that B-roll you just saw from Brazil was shot by him when we were there. We had a great team. Fantastic. Shout out to Gabby as well, and I think this is going to be great. People's Dispatch will have a lot. Brazil de Fato, which is a partner of us here at Breakthrough News. They have Portuguese and English coverage that you will be able to follow, I think, certainly now, but all throughout the day on Sunday as well for those who are interested. Well, we're going to switch gears here, Rania. Oh, wait, almost missed somebody. Frank Schofield. Shout out to you, sir. Thank you very much for your donation. Greatly appreciated. We're going to switch gears here, going to go to the other side of the world, so to speak here. Really just a wave of resistance happening in Palestine, was on the front pages for a while. It's fallen off a little bit here now, but major, major important issues there. Very honored to be joined once again here on the show by Hadeel Shatara, who's the Palestinian coordinator of the Palestinian prisoner rights group, Samidoun, and we are very happy to be talking to her from Ramallah in the West Bank. Hadeel, thank you so much for being back with us here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me once again. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we are really glad to have you. And I guess my first question is, give us a sense of the situation in Nablus and other parts of the West Bank. I think in the U.S., all we really get in the media is that, Palestinians are doing violent things. And obviously, that is a gross distortion amongst other things.
Well, it's expected from the American government to view it that way, or the right media. So the situation here has been hectic since, actually it's been hectic since last year, 2021, especially in May. And now, since March, things have been escalating at all levels. At the same time, a new forms of resistance started appearing in the West Bank. And we haven't seen this in the West Bank for a long time, since the second Intifada in 2000. Nablus is under a blockade now for almost 20 days. All the checkpoints are closed. People are stuck in Nablus. The movement is being controlled by the Zionist army, and the settlers are attacking people everywhere. It's the olive harvest season these days in Palestine, and we witness attacks by the Zionist settlers protected by the army almost everywhere around the West Bank. Situation in Jerusalem is almost the same. We have clashes every single day, demonstrations happening every single day, attacks to Al-Aqsa mosque every single day by settlers. So the situation has been really, really hectic. But what we're seeing is the formation of new forms of resistance in the West Bank. We're seeing groups appearing around the West Bank, especially started in Jenin, now recently in Tulkarem, and we're seeing where this is taken us. So now we're talking about what's going on and what started in Jenin now is in Nablus, Arin al-Usud. They're leading what's happening. They're able to go into strikes, and all the citizens here in Palestine are listening to their statements, are paying attention to what they're saying, and they're following them as they're leading the situation recently.
It's so interesting, Hadeel, because for a long time, armed resistance across Palestine was kind of isolated to Gaza, right? And now you have groups in the West Bank that are actually carrying out operations against Israeli soldiers. And so you have this group Lion's Den, it's being referred to as. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on with this particular group, which is actually like been attacking, like it's actually been launching operations against Israeli soldiers, and having clashes, because this is unusual in terms of the West Bank. In the West Bank, we're so used to a very pacified, occupied area where it's very difficult for people to fight back. But in this case, we're seeing something very different.
Really happening is, as I mentioned before, since the second Intifada, all the armed resistance in the West Bank was demolished. And all the weapons were taken away from the West Bank. And the West Bank is an open area where it's fully sieged by the settlements and the settlements everywhere. It's controlled by the settlers. We have a lot of checkpoints. We have a lot of the movement in the West Bank is not easy. But what we have been seeing recently is the amount of attacks by the Israeli side is massive. The amount of arrests in the West Bank is increasing every single day. So what happened recently is that these young men took a decision to go back to the armed resistance in the West Bank to find a way to do it, because they're not only being targeted by the Israelis, they're also targeted by the BA. And this is one of the problems we were facing in the West Bank. In order to have armed struggle in the West Bank, we have to have clashes with the BA first. So these young men are targeted by the BA, but they took a decision that we've had enough. So since March, when Abdullah al-Husari was killed, and he was one of the first martyrs from the armed group, he's from Jenin's brigade. Information and new it's encouraged to join and to carry weapons and to seek armed resistance, finding out that this is the only way to protect our lives. So instead of sitting watching demonstrations in the middle of cities, we took the resistance into a different level, because in order to protect our lives, because now we're really fighting for our lives every single day, and it's a fight for basic human being rights. And armed resistance is protected by all the international laws, because we're fighting the occupation who are attacking us. And the West Bank has a lot of settlements. It's surrounded everywhere by all these groups of settlers, of Zionists. There's a massive land confiscation. There's a massive attacks on people. So this was the main reason for these young groups to start new form of organizing. And we found out that organized work is the only way to actually make change. And the way they started is, they started in the old city of Nablus. The old city of Nablus has a lot of the architecture there is a bit different and old, and can offer them a small protection there. And they know the area very well. So they started the formation there, knowing the area very well, knowing how to move and how to create a better movement. So they started attacking and started the clashes to show and to prove and to deliver a message to the occupation that the Palestinian will always fight. So this is what's scaring the occupation now. Whenever they reach a point where, okay, we're not going to let them fight, we're demolishing, we're stopping this, a young group comes out of there, starting a new form and using new tools.
Yeah, I mean, it really has been, so interesting to watch. I mean, it feels like a whole new generation of people who are emerging here, and unfortunate that we have to still be talking about this generation after generation. But I don't know. I became involved in politics in many ways in 2002 because of the awareness I had of the second Intifada, and so to see again people rising is against all odds. Really amazing to see. I think, here it is. No matter what, you cannot keep Palestinian people down. I mean, that seems to be the case. And I wonder from your perspective, especially because, you see some of these people, they're very young, 17, 18. I mean, it also feels like a fight for their own future, that people don't want to live in what is essentially an open air prison for their whole lives. They want to live like everyone else. They want to live like human beings. And I don't know, that's kind of how I look at it. I don't know if that seems right. right, that it really is a fight for the future of the youth of Palestine, among so many other things.
It is. If you look at the recent years and what we've been facing in the recent years, there is an actual fear from the future. There is a black image of the future that started to appear in the last few years. But after what happened in Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah, people started having hope again. People started seeing the path again and started using more tools again. And we know that this popular protection of these is what needed to protect them in order to continue their work. More organized work on the ground by the popular force will protect these young men. So, and we saw this. We saw how the people of Palestine are protecting them, how they're supporting them, how we're sticking to all their statements and listening to them. These young people do have this fear for a future because if we don't fight now, then the next generation will not have this future. There are no jobs. Everything is being controlled. The air is being controlled. They cannot leave the country. There are a lot of issues stopping them. Water resources are rare. We cannot plant lands. There's nothing to do. So yes, the future has a dark image, and fighting back is the only way to draw another path for the future. And this is what's happening. If you keep pushing people to the edge, people will revolt. So we hope this uprising turns into intifada, actually.
And, I mean, you mentioned the issue of the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, and how, there's this kind of double sort of enemy that needs to be fought, right? It's not just the Israelis, but it's this local force that has been created and funded and armed by the United States and supported by the Israelis that collaborates. Do you see, and I mean, Mahmoud Abbas can only be in charge for so long. What happens after he's not anymore? Do you see the Palestinian Authority, the PA, as something that can actually continue to exist moving forward, even without Mahmoud Abbas?
Hopefully not, but I mean, Nablus is waiting while all the BA and the other parties, the leaders of the parties, were in Algeria, ending the division that is only level. People are not divided on the ground. They're divided on their levels, and it's affecting all of us. So yes, the BA is now putting us. There are the ones who are stopping any revolution in the West Bank. They're um, they're adding more pressure to people who are fighting. So yes, we see a future without the BA. We see a future that is different. We're trying new tools because if you look at all the Palestinian bodies now, they're not functional as they were. If you let go the resistance, then you lose the people, and this is what we're seeing. When the BA asks or sends out a call for people to go on the streets, no one goes on the streets. While when young men, 18 years old, ask people to go out on the street at 1:30 a.m. at night, the whole country went out on the streets. Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, Gaza went out on the streets. So yes, there is a future without the Palestinian Authority and the form they're taking, unless they take a different form and they fight for people and they go back to the resistance.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hadeel, as always, we really appreciate you joining us from the ground there in the West Bank in Ramallah. And of course, you are with the very important Palestinian prisoner rights group, Samidun, which everyone can check out, and I hope they do. But as always, thanks so much for giving us some of your time.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, it's just lion's den. I think, it's they always say that the resistance is dead, that Palestinians, are just whatever, they're all cowed, and there's nothing that's going to happen, and there's normalization, and there's this and there's that, and every time they try to turn the page, the people come back with steadfastness, which I know is a big principle there in Palestine. It's what do they say? It's samud, I think is what they call it. But yeah, it's very interesting to see. I mean, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old people, and they can't seem to defeat them.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say it's really incredible because Israel does run this like really intricate, complex network of control that has a lot of high tech equipment to it, a lot of manpower to it, which is why they have, every Israeli has to serve in the army because they have to be occupiers. This kind of like indefinite occupation to continue to like push Palestinians into smaller and smaller enclaves, control their every movement. And the fact that it's been this way for so long and still you can't prevent people who are being subjugated and oppressed and occupied and forced to live in these segregated apartheid conditions. The fact that you can't force them to just shut up and stay down shows you that this is never going to go away. Like Israel's never going to be able to just have this sort of peaceful, as they see it, peaceful for them kind of occupation where there's zero consequences. No matter how high tech it gets, no matter how, controlling and complex their system of control gets, and no matter how much American support they have. And honestly, moving forward, this is not to sound like, the Israeli occupation is going to end tomorrow, but as you have the U.S. be less and less engaged from the region, Israel is going to be more on its own to deal with that reality. It's not always going to have mommy America to back every little thing it does. It will for the indefinite future, I suppose, but not forever.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good segue into another piece here, and shout out to the anonymous donation we just made, and that is the upcoming November 1st legislative elections in Israel, where, of course, the Israeli politicians are hotly, well, I can't really say they're debating, but they're discussing, how they want to pursue these policies, both, in the occupied territories, Palestine more broadly, but also in relationship to the world. And we are very, very honored to have back with us here the independent, on-the-ground investigative journalist, David Sheen. David, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I have to say, I feel like I'm partially in sort of like the Night of the Living Dead kind of situation here, because they tell me that Netanyahu could potentially become the Prime Minister of Israel yet again here in the upcoming elections. I mean, A, does that seem possible to you, David? And B, maybe just give us a scene setter of where we are going just a few days away from the elections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sad to say it's a very real possibility. More to the point, it's probably the most likely possibility that in just a few days from now, we could see the re-election of Benjamin Netanyahu as Israel's prime minister. He's already the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history, but he may get another chance to do so. At present, his bloc, let's say the parties that have aligned behind him, since in Israel there's no one party that can win an outright majority, they got to cobble together a coalition, but the bloc of parties he has behind him is larger than the so-called opposition bloc. Of course, we're teetering close to the middle, and he needs to get a majority of 61 seats out of 120. So will he do that? There's a chance he won't. And there's a chance that we may go to another round of elections, our fifth elections, and in 2 years we may see a sixth. But yeah, it's quite likely that Netanyahu will come back. And if that happens, I know this is a common refrain, like you say, every time Netanyahu comes back, it's the new most racist government in Israel's history. But this one really, really, really is going to be more racist than ever before. Quite scary.
I mean, I think that does speak to something that you've been covering for a very long time, David, which is the sort of increasingly racist and right-wing nature of Israeli society. And, I'm constantly following you and following others on that. But I do want to get to some of the more domestic issues. But I'm curious also what you think it might mean regionally speaking, in terms of what Netanyahu's saying to distinguish himself from his opponents, particularly, and maybe this is a bit of a self-interested question because I live in Lebanon, but particularly with these, for example, this new maritime negotiation that the Israelis and the Lebanese are about to sign for the maritime border. I know that's something that Netanyahu's done in recent weeks, is try and say that Yair Lapid has capitulated to terrorists, has capitulated to Hezbollah. So I'm curious if things like that, and maybe that just to broaden it out a bit, if you think that Netanyahu in power would be more likely to escalate against Israel's so-called enemies in the region, speaking of, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria. Not that Israel isn't doing that now, but, even more so by maybe pulling back out of the deal that was made with Lebanon.
Sure. It's funny, just a couple days ago, the front page of Israel's top-selling national newspapers Israel has not attacked Damascus for an entire month. That was A1 above the fold headline.
I don't even think that's true.
It may have been like 20 days or something like that. Maybe they rounded up to, you know what I mean? But in any case, literally the next day, Israel did bomb Damascus. So I'm just trying to give perspective here on Israel doesn't really recognize, allegedly, Israel signed a border agreement with Lebanon, but does it even recognize the borders of other countries? It's constantly bombing its neighbors. I think that, paradoxically, in some ways, Netanyahu may perhaps launch fewer adventurous wars, because it seems like often it needs to be the left needs to prove, so-called left, right? The left of Netanyahu, the centrist nationalists, have to prove their toughness, because the populace has been demanding harsher and harsher political stances. So Netanyahu already has his credibility as Mr. Security, so-called. It's Dafka when we have the so-called centrist alternative to him, the current Prime Minister Yair Lapid, that you see an increase in army attacks in the West Bank. We've seen in Nablus in recent weeks, and it's I would be more expecting that to happen actually from a centrist government. But yeah, it could go that way. What I'm more afraid of, if Netanyahu comes back, is we will see the vestiges of democracy for the Jewish population be dissipated, and that's in order to empower Netanyahu to evade the current trial he's under. His partners have already said, if we get elected, we will actually cancel the laws that he has been accused of and that he's currently on trial for. So in the middle of the trial, he would just get off freely. But more to the point, they want to, of course, completely end the Supreme Court's power and the Attorney General's power, so that there can't be any protections to minorities. Of course, these institutions have always green-lighted and rubber-stamped nearly every single outrage of every Israeli government towards Palestinians and other minorities. But in some cases, it's, buffed the worst excesses, or put some kind of stopgap so that it doesn't get even worse. But now that's not enough. So the right has promised, if they have their election, then they're going to, do away with the powers of the Supreme Court. But more than this, what's frightening is that Netanyahu's most important ally will be the leader of the Kahanist party, the most extreme party, and in fact, a terrorist group, the most murderous Jewish terrorist group of the last 50 years, the Kahana movement. This is someone who, for 33 years, they were, they weren't allowed officially into the Knesset, ostensibly because they were so racist. But of course, in that time, in those 33 years, Israel itself has become more and more racist, or more to the point, the mask has come off and it's become acceptable to be openly racist more and more. So now the reason that they were ejected originally from the Knesset was even the right wing, the so-called, the centrist rightists or whatnot, but the Likud party, Netanyahu's party, said that's too far gone, and so we're going to, that kind of open, outright racism, calling for ethnic cleansing and inciting that kind of absolute racial hatred. That's too far. It's a step too far for the Likud. But now that person, the leader of that Kahanist party, is Netanyahu's most important ally, because he will be the next biggest party. Netanyahu's party would be the largest party in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, but the second largest party in Netanyahu's government coalition would be led by the Kahanists. Just to give you one more perspective on that, in the last election, when they were mainstreamed by Netanyahu, when he brought them, brought them into coalition so that they could pass the voter threshold, the Kahanists had to join another party to ensure that they would pass that threshold. There was a worry that they wouldn't have enough votes to pass the 4%, let's say 3.5%, to get into the Israeli Knesset. This time around, in the last, really, it's only been, a year and a half since the last election. In that time, the normalization has created a new reality where once they've been normalized, now people feel, okay, I can admittedly be Kahanist. I could admittedly own it and just demand ethnic cleansing outright and not be embarrassed about it. So now, yes, Netanyahu once again got the Kahanists to join up with another far-right party, but this time it was because the other faction, there was a worry that it might not get into the Knesset on its own. There is no question that the Kahanists could get in on their own. They have ballooned. And it's not only that he's got, the Knesset as a platform from which to speak. It's also the complicity of the Israeli media, because every single outlet has been giving him prime time. It was just announced in the Israeli news today that in the election cycle, if you count all the hours that every single Palestinian politician, Palestinian citizen of Israel who's running for the Knesset, if you count all the coverage they've got altogether combined, it's only a third of the coverage that one Kahanist party leader, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has been getting in the Israeli media. That's how much they platform him.
Wow.
And of course, yeah, there you go. I mean, what more can you say, really? So this is a guy
pulling out guns and stuff on people. I mean, it's amazing, and some of it feels, or maybe the way to really I want to phrase the question is, I mean, what does this mean for parties like the Joint List and others inside of Israel who try to promote a pluralist vision, and it seems like the level of siege people will be under will be more than just sort of electoral. Like, it's not just that they won't get a lot of votes, but that really this could be a shift in even like the physical safety of those who are trying to present a different vision.
No question, Eugene. I mean, a year ago, May 2021, I believe was the last time we spoke. At that time, I had just come out of the hospital after I looked a little bit different. But in any case, I'm happy to be healthier now when I'm coming back to tell you. But at that time, I remember it so distinctly because what we had was anti-Palestinian pogroms. We had race riots across the country, and in a large measure, it was Ben-Gvir, the leader of the Kahanist party, who incited those, who organized his Jewish Power Party affiliates, who organized these anti-Palestinian pogroms in so-called mixed cities across those few cities in Israel where Jews and Palestinians actually live side by side in the same cities, just a handful of them. But in those cities, he, because they were so outraged, Palestinians were protesting in solidarity. I mean, Palestinian citizens of Israel were protesting in solidarity with their fellow Palestinians in East Jerusalem and in Gaza. And all of a sudden, he's like, well, if these Palestinian citizens of Israel are disloyal, then we will bring the fight to them. And that's what they did. And we saw, just yesterday, a couple of days ago, we saw.
Oh, did we lose David? I wasn't sure if. Oh, there we go.
Oh, we got you back.
You got me.
Sorry, I cut for a second.
Case, no worries. But in any case, the pogroms that Itamar Ben-Gvir incited, and this is according not just to David, police chief, who said that this was a Jewish intifada that he incited. So these race riots, that was just the first phase. Now, his popularity has only increased, and his party has organized new militias where they openly say, we are private militias. Before, he started a militia that was going to patrol the Nakab in the south of the country, in the desert, and that would mean, the security of Bedouin citizens of Israel would be in peril. Now he's saying, we are starting in Bat Yam. This is the place where a Palestinian man was lynched, beaten by a mob. We saw this like a live streaming of a lynching we saw last May. That location, Bat Yam, which is just south of Tel Aviv, that's where he's starting up a new militia. Now, these militias, you would think if the government would be like, no, we need a monopoly on violence. But what we see now is a hand-in-glove operation where, ostensibly they should be cracking down on these militias, but they're working in partnership with them. They're not cracking down on them. And furthermore, that's in the cities. Of course, when we go into the Palestinian territories where there's military law, then you just see, Kahanist militias just attacking Palestinians willy-nilly, attacking their property, attacking their persons, and soldiers just standing and milling about, walking amongst them, making no effort whatsoever to stop them from doing so mid-pogrom. So we're really at a new level. And keep in mind all this, this level of violence that, the right has whipped up against Palestinians. This occurred under a Lapid government or a so-called government of change, the alternative to Netanyahu. That's often when the far right is that's when they unleash all of their full barrels, because they are trying to they want to change in government. So will we see even more of these when it comes out? It's difficult to say, but instead of the police commissioner saying tut tut, Itamar Ben-Gvir organized a Jewish intifada, what we may see when Netanyahu gets elected is that same Itamar Ben-Gvir now as the police minister. So he's the one in charge of the police. The person who organized the pogroms is now in charge of the police forces of the country. That's a very likely scenario that we may see in just a few days' time.
Yeah, that's really frightening.
Yeah, that's wow. Well, here we are yet again, but I think, it's important for people to follow this because it's big implications for a lot of people. And, as always, David, we're also happy that you're feeling better, that you're healthier, and that you're back with us here on Breakthrough News. And we know it's late over there for you. So thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
My pleasure. I just want to also say, Mabruk, Taranya, the award you won, very well deserved.
Oh, thank you. It was a Women in Media Award. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Cool. My pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, Rania, definitely. That's fantastic. You deserve many awards. And yeah, David always breaks it down just amazingly. You just think, what is going on? I think so much of it is, even for those of us who know about the issue, you're just inundated with so much propaganda about Israel, and it's just so pervasive, the depths of how terrible these people really are. Sometimes it's hard to fathom, and they have such a apparatus. I was talking to someone earlier about that guy Nas Daily, and they've got all these different little points to kind of trick you,
Yeah. It's also, I think it's hard for people in the West to relate to in so many ways, in terms of or to understand about Israel in terms of its move to the right, because it's not just a right-wing politics and right-wing leaders that are getting elected. It's also Israeli society.
Yeah.
Is the younger people are the more right-wing ones. I think in a lot of countries, like in the US, for example, if you poll people on ideology or where they are on the spectrum, younger people tend to be more left, older people tend to be more right, and more Republican. In Israel, it's the opposite. It's a situation where younger people are increasingly more nationalistic, increasingly more racist against Arabs. And there's even an issue in Israeli schools where teachers are scared to say or teach certain things certain ways, or they'll be accused of being leftists, which is a really dirty term, or Arab lovers. So it's a very different situation than I think a lot of us, because I think Israel often gets portrayed as this sort of, little piece of the West in a tumultuous Middle East, when in fact it's not actually relatable at all. If you compare the politics there and where they're moving to what we might be seeing in a place like the U.S.
No, and more and more you see the people who feel differently forced to flee the country, essentially, and live, in Europe or somewhere else because they're
the irony, right?
It is, right? It is deeply, deeply ironic on multiple levels. Shout out to Martha Allen. Okay, that's a good name. That's a name I like to see in the chat there. Going back to the old Venezuelan Embassy Protection Days. Thank you so much for your donation. Also, the anonymous donation we saw, really appreciate that as well. So we got old friends and new friends joining us here on Breakthrough News as the Freedom Side Live continues. And we want to keep going here. Want to turn our attention to another issue that spans a couple countries here, and that is this, new Cold War style atmosphere, especially as it is playing out vis-a-vis, the high tech world and engineers and other people of that ilk, if you will. And we're very happy to be joined as we continue the show by KJ No, who's a peace activist, scholar on the geopolitics of Asia, and an organizer with Pivot to Peace. KJ, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And, I want to start here with Merrick Garland's press conference. I guess that was towards the end of last week, and really, I mean, it was this huge production, really, in the DOJ that seemed designed to create this sort of scare tactic attitude, well beyond just the issue he was addressing. But I know a lot of people heard it, maybe some didn't. What exactly was he alleging at that press conference, and what are the implications of what seems to be an aggressive, attempt to demonize people, Chinese people or people of Chinese descent who are working in certain fields?
Well, I think there are a bunch of cases involved there. There are at least three distinct cases. They have to do with charges of obstruction of a criminal case. They also have to do with charges of foreign nationals attempting to procure sensitive technological information and interfere with protests. And then there are another two that have been arrested and five that have been charged over harassment of Chinese Americans or American citizens of Chinese descent who were being apparently harassed to return. But I think the key thing to note in this announcement is first the extraordinary firepower that they brought to this announcement. It's not normal for the Attorney General and the Assistant Attorney General and the FBI chief to come out and announce some kind of prosecution. Usually that job falls to a district attorney. And so just the extraordinary kind of theatricality around it lets you know that this is highly, highly political. I think the other thing to note about this is that for example, the first case, which is really about the obstruction of a criminal investigation relating to Huawei, they don't mention Huawei, but essentially they're bringing up the Huawei case back up on the screen. The allegation is that two Chinese officials tried to bribe some U.S. official to get information about testimony and about witness lists. Now, that seems very absurd to me because first, the Chinese strategy on Huawei was diplomatic pressure. It didn't have to do with a legal strategy. And secondly, even if it came down to a court case, witness lists and witness testimony have to be shared with the counterparty. So it's kind of very, very suspect that somebody would have gone to such extraordinary extent to get information which would have been released anyway. And to add on top of it, these are cases that can never be prosecuted. They're purely symbolic or rhetorical cases because the U.S. is not going to be able to extradite a Chinese official and then bring them to stand case. So in that sense, these charges are neither provable nor disprovable. And when something is neither provable or disprovable, you have to understand that it's either a fantasy or a doctrine of faith. It has nothing to do with reality. I can say that Martians are interfering with our government and indict those Martians, but that does not mean that is true because it's neither provable nor disprovable. And I think on that level, we are no longer dealing with reality, but really we're dealing with propaganda and doublespeak.
Okay, so in that sense, then what was the point of this? Is this part of the broader U.S. campaign, years-long campaign, to try to sabotage Huawei? And then why? Like, why? Can you break out or lay out, for our audience, what the purpose of all of this actually is?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think the first thing we have to note is timing. And this is timed to coincide with the end of the 20th National Party Congress in China. And a lot of these statements are directed directly against the statements that were made during the second 20th Party Congress. That is to say, quote unquote, non-interference and win-win, etc., and sovereignty, all of these things. This is a direct and political rebuttal of that. It's not a strong rebuttal. In fact, I would say that it doesn't function as a rebuttal at all because it's so weak. And the case itself is depicted in such cartoonish terms that I have to wonder really about the kind of prose and the the language skills. I learned English as a second language, but to say something like the our agents thwarted, the persistent threat by the agents of the PRC. I mean, that's a level of, cartoonish prose. I mean, the only thing missing from that is the word dastardly. So I think that it is clearly a strongly political statement. But more than that, it's time to refute the CPC 20th National Congress, NPC. It's also designed to create more justification for the semiconductor sanctions by pointing out that anything that a private corporation does is always backed up by Chinese government officials. Therefore, there's that constant enmeshment between the government and corporations. And then I think the third thing, which may be a little bit of a stretch, is that it may have to do with the bolstering of a U.S. A prosecutor. This is the DA who prosecuted An Ming, who has been promoted to U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Tennessee, and that may also be designed to bolster his case because there's such an extraordinary outcry against his appointment, because he was the one who created this utterly fraudulent case against An Minghu, a Chinese researcher.
And I'm glad you brought up that last point, KJ, because, this is, well, I can certainly remember it going back to the Clinton administration, but I don't know what else to call it other than sort of racist element of what's being approached to researchers both from China, people who are, Chinese American people, and this attempt to throw suspicion on them that we've seen kind of accelerated by the most recent element of the chip war, if you will, which is that any American or anyone who holds permanent residency, or I think any other sort of legal immigration status, who is working, in this industry with Chinese companies, can have that taken away from them, essentially can be banned from the country. And I mean, it seems to me that it's just designed to cast it's designed certainly to hobble China, but I think it seems to me to just be designed to cast aspersions on, a whole race of people working in one industry. I don't know what they're seeking to accomplish with that, but it does seem to be deeply pernicious.
Well, it's a form of enforcing, what has now become researching while Chinese. Just like driving while brown or black is a de facto crime, researching while Chinese has become a crime. And so all Chinese researchers, scientists, engineers are currently under this shadow of doubt. Prior to this, there was the China Initiative, which, according to the FBI director, they were opening a case against a Chinese person every 10 to 12 hours. They claim that the China Initiative has gone away, but clearly it is continuing under different forms. And people have asked about this recent declaration by the Attorney General and asked them, what's the name of this, project that you have where you're going after, Chinese people? And they say, well, there is no name. The China Initiative is over. But with the same breath, they say, we will not relent in our persecution or prosecution of Chinese. So once again, the doublespeak. All of this ties into the fact that this is designed to create fear, hatred, and loathing against Chinese people. And it is part of the information warfare that is being waged against China as this subkinetic or prekinetic dimension of ongoing war. So the hybrid war involves lawfare, legal warfare, and that ties into this information warfare, which is about tarring, delegitimizing, and pointing out the Chinese are dirty, dastardly, and deceitful. They're part of the jungle. They're not part of the garden. We have to keep them out.
And so much of this is tied up in a fear in the U.S. of China becoming more powerful technologically and economically, right? Like so much of this Cold War isn't just ideological. A lot of it is based in material reality of China's rise as this economic powerhouse that is building all of this technology, developing all of this technology that I believe, there was all this fear just a few months ago about China's semiconductors will soon outpace those that are produced in Taiwan, for example. So in many ways, this Cold War is in fact a technological war. Can you talk about the significance of China and its development capacity when it comes to things like, I'm not an expert in this stuff, so I might say words that sound silly or juvenile or like a little ignorant, but the issue of semiconductors comes up a lot. The issue of like chips, right? We don't want Huawei. Like one of the reasons that Huawei is always under attack is because of how it's able to develop chips. And the US is constantly saying, oh, China stole this from us. Like we developed it. And then Chinese companies stole it. And that's why they even have this technology. But is it true, in fact, that a lot of this is just about the fact that China is at this pace going to have more advanced technology than the US or its allies might in the coming years?
It does. China does have more advanced technology in certain areas, quantum computing, 5 and 6G networks, high-speed rail, etc. There are many areas in which China is overtaking the United States, despite having, 1/5 of the per capita GDP. So China is developing leaps and bounds. Its academies are extraordinary. It is currently ranked number 1 in high quality scientific research publication. It's number 1 or 2 in patents. It's the most sought after place for scientists to travel and work in. Just last year, I think 1,400 Chinese scientists left the United States and decided to go to work in China because of all this, persecution. But I think you're absolutely correct. The tech war is indistinguishable from the economic war, which is designed to take China down, to prevent China from developing and modernizing on its own terms. Just very briefly, we have to understand in the post-World War II era, the majority of countries that were able to break out of the neocolonial trap and become developed, there are only about half a dozen of them. And the majority of them are their capitalist show ponies like Taiwan and South Korea, which were given extraordinary exemptions, or their sui generis city-states like Singapore, or their, tax havens or petrostates. China is the only country that has broken out of colonization and become a developed state on its own terms. And it's done it in a way where modernization does not mean becoming more capitalist or more Western, but it's developing on its own terms. The US cannot tolerate that, and it cannot tolerate that example, and it cannot tolerate China becoming a kind of center of gravity or a different pole of development that other countries can model, connect with. And so this is why this attempt to literally to prevent China's development, destroy its economy, is taking on such extreme measures. And you mentioned a little bit earlier that it is now a crime for any American to be working at a Chinese company, or even a green card holder to be working at a Chinese company. I mean, that is an extraordinary extraterritorial overreach. And I think it does away with any notion that we have of freedom of choice, of freedom of conscience, of freedom of association. So I think these are extraordinary times, and they speak to both the harshness, the deliberateness, but also, in a certain sense, the desperation of the United States as it seeks to prevent China from moving up the production scale.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the desperation and final piece here. Because I think many have argued that the strategy is backfiring, that ultimately, China is just, doing more to develop its own capacity since it's being shut out of so many areas by the United States, and that exactly what they hope to accomplish, they will fail, and that rather than focusing on the U.S.'s own capacities, just trying to stop China, is actually maybe helping them accelerate and leapfrog the U.S. because of the extra effort.
I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, anytime, this has been an ongoing process for a very, very long time. Anytime China is shut out of a technological field, it simply develops its own capacity and then surpasses the countries that were shutting it out. We can see this in the space station. China was forced out of the space station. They built their own. And they sent a rover to Mars on a single shot that is unheard of in the history of aeronautics. And they sent, and they also explored the far side of the moon. So these are just extraordinary accomplishments that China is going from strength to strength. Currently, it's understood that China does not have the capacity to build the most advanced chips at the current moment, especially those related to AI. And very advanced computing of 7 nanometers and below. But the fact is, China still has a very, very large capacity within and of itself. It spends $400 billion buying chips from other countries. It can simply turn those funds to itself. And if I may give you an analogy, it's a kind of a, if you will, if we think of microchips as being similar to potato chips, it's true that the U.S. holds the franchise on the potato chips, but it's clear that China has the potatoes, that is to say, the raw materials, and Russia has the oil. So it's not as simple as people think it is. The supply chain is complex. China has tremendous internal capacity, and I think that ultimately, over the long term, China is going to come out ahead, and the U.S. is going to see that there's tremendous blowback from these very, very foolish, short-sighted bans.
KJ No, as always, we really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Certainly our pleasure. And yeah, so many things here. I mean, I was thinking about this earlier today. There's all big, so many huge American companies, they're like domiciled in Ireland, or they have some Irish, subsidiary,
Really?
so they can funnel the profits over there and not pay any taxes. So, essentially tax evasion, although that's called tax avoidance. But, imagine if they just said no Irish Americans, would be able to work, for any companies in Ireland that are doing tax evasion. I mean, it's just the racist element of this, to where you can demonize a country like China, to where these extreme measures seem basically okay and routine, is really something to behold. And yeah, I mean, it's obviously backfiring. I mean, clearly China is continuing to move forward on a number of different fronts. I mean, and here in the United States, you can't build one piece of high-speed rail. I mean, it's nothing. And they claim they're giving this $54 billion so-called CHIPS Act, money that they would have spent anyway to compete with these companies from Taiwan and South Korea and Japan. So it's just a corporate welfare handout. And by the way, they're building a couple little, demonstration projects in different places like Arizona, whatever. But all these companies are not bringing jobs back to the United States in any significant fashion. In fact, they're going all around the world looking for what other countries have extremely low wage labor. And I'll give you one of them is Haiti. And one of the major goals of the U.S. trade policy of having these extremely low wages, the average Haitian worker, by the way, has a minimum wage of $7.50 per day. Now, they want to move them up the supply chain from not just making hats and T-shirts, but to making all sorts of little small high-tech parts like this, specifically for the military-industrial complex, some of whom who are already down there and in there. So this is not going to be some great revival, as Biden is saying, but just a shifting of the gears of the exploitation of low-wage labor. But with Haiti in the news, I thought that was an important one to also mention, the doubling down there on the exploitation of the Haitian people. But we're going to switch gears here now, certainly to another case of exploitation, and that is the student debt crisis that is affecting, I think, basically everyone who has been to college in the past 20 or 30 years, certainly all the ones that I know. And we are very honored to be joined here by Sparky Abraham, who is the legal strategist for the Debt Collective. Sparky, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're very happy to have you. And maybe just to set the stage, I think many people, perhaps one of them being my co-host, are wondering about what is actually going on with this student debt relief, because we're hearing a lot, but then there's all these rules and people are being ruled ineligible. I mean, what exactly was decreed by the Biden administration, and where are we in terms of the debt relief, I guess, big picture?
Big picture, things are still on track for the broad-based debt relief. And I think part of the confusion here is there are a bunch of different programs with a bunch of different requirements going in a bunch of different directions. But if we're talking about the big broad-based relief, which is $10,000 or $20,000, depending on if you received a Pell Grant, that is still, for the most part, on track. The couple wrinkles there are that for folks who had older loans who did not consolidate before the end of September, they have to some extent been written out for now, which is not a move that I'm a fan of, but was part of a response to some of the lawsuits. And then those lawsuits also so far have been widely unsuccessful, but there is right now an administrative stay, which is to say no court has found that this plan is illegal, but they've basically said, okay, we'll just hold on for a week while we get some expedited briefing. That's in place right now, but that's not going to be in place by the time the cancellation actually starts happening, which won't happen for another few weeks anyway. So the application, such as it is, a very, very short application for the $10,000 or $20,000 of relief is still open. I think around 20 million people have filled it out so far. Strongly encourage folks to go fill it out. There's really not much to lose.
It's interesting because there's the one thing that changed kind of after it had been announced in order to prevent certain lawsuits from succeeding was the issue of what kind of loan you had. And it was, there's some of these loans that have just been sold to so many different loan servicers that even if they were government subsidized loans, they suddenly are being serviced by some private company like Navient or something. That's one of the bigger ones that keeps getting mentioned. So it made all of these people who have, none of it was their own fault. They just, now these are loans that don't qualify. So that's one thing that's been quite confusing that I know a lot of people, myself included, have questions about what that means exactly. And then the other thing that I've seen, and these are very selfish questions on my part, but I know there's lots of other people who have them as well, because I've seen a lot of the Twitter chatter and online chatter about this. We've
all got the same questions.
Right. Is the other issue too, is there's been this bizarre advice that I haven't seen from any government website of if you paid any loans after the moratorium or was in place after 2020, you can actually apply to get that reimbursed and then have those forgiven. But these are just random people saying this in news articles. So, I mean, can you speak to those two issues? Because that's what I'm confused about. I know a lot of other people are.
Yes. So the first thing that you mentioned was sort of the servicer changes. And that has been very confusing for a long time. And part of the issue, and a lot of what some of the current actions are meant to address, is the fact that not only have servicers been changing and switching around for years, but they've also just been giving people horrible information for a very long time. Navient is a prime example of that. The federal government has been in a lawsuit against Navient for several years now for misleading student borrowers, all the while still paying Navient to service federal student loans, which is absurd beyond belief. In terms of this particular relief, who your servicer is doesn't really matter as much as what type of loan you have, particularly whether you have a federal direct loan as opposed to a guaranteed loan. And the time period for that generally is like pre-2010. You're more likely to have guaranteed loan. If you got your loan after 2010, you're almost certain to have a direct loan. And the sort of cutoff that they introduced was they said that as of September 29th, anyone who had a guaranteed loan would not get the $10,000 or $20,000 relief. And the reason for that, I mean, we can get into it if you want. It's a little bit complicated, but basically just the federal government is not the owner of those loans. Somebody else is the owner of those loans. And the owners of those loans are at least somewhat involved in the lawsuits. And so that was just kind of like a stopgap to say, like, okay, let's try to shut these lawsuits down by introducing this limit. Personally, I don't think that was necessary or wise, and I think it wrote a lot of people out of relief that they absolutely deserve. But that's what's happening. That's what's happening there. It doesn't necessarily have to do with who your servicer is or anything like that. It's what type of loan you have, which kind of comes down to how long you've had it in some cases. In terms of the refund, it is true. It is true that if you have a loan that is eligible for the COVID payment pause, which tend to be direct loans, those ones issued after 2010, and you made payments anyway, you can call your servicer and get a refund of those payments. Now, for whom will that be beneficial? I mean, it's going to depend on people's individual circumstances, but I would say if you are slated to have your loans canceled, either through the broad-based relief or through public service loan forgiveness or something else, might as well go get that refund and have that amount canceled instead. I think there are good and bad reasons why the Department of Education isn't necessarily touting that fact, but it is a fact. People are doing it.
Well, I think that's crucially important information. And I mean, there's just so many different angles to this, and I think that, and I'm, praying for everyone to get the maximum amount of debt relief possible. But I think even for people who have their loans forgiven, for people who have, large amounts of just strictly private loans, there's one, I don't know if it's legal, but it certainly feels moral element of just outright predatory lending. I can remember when I took out my first student loan and they asked me where I was going to live, and I was saying maybe on campus. And they basically convinced me to take out another $20,000 to live off campus and how cool it would be to live off campus. And now every time I pay, I'm just like, I can't believe that they said this. I was like an 18-year-old, 19-year-old kid. And it just feels that, I don't know, that there's something about this that was just so unjust and so immoral to this student debt crisis that even beyond this relief, that so much more has to be done, not just to relieve people, but I don't know, to hold someone accountable for this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the whole idea of student debt, if you just take a step back from our current context and think about this, it is mind-bogglingly unjust, right? Like, I am in debt because I wanted to have an education and did not have rich parents who could pay for it. And so that's now going to follow me for decades of my life. And I'm going to be paying interest, and I'm going to be, kept in my job for fear of leaving and kept out of the housing market, et cetera, right? All of these consequences down the line. When, my view and the debt collective's view is that education is a public good. Right? There's no reason we should be doing this any differently from how we do primary or secondary education. Education should be free and open for all. And to the extent that we need to, offset the cost of that, we do it through taxes. We socialize this good. The benefits of education are socialized. And so the cost of it should be too. That's the heart of this. And so our call is still, and always has been, cancel all of the debt and make all education free. That being said, even the idea that we would get any federal debt cancellation was truly laughable in mainstream circles just a few years ago. People really laughed at it. John Oliver had a whole segment laughing about it. And so I think the fact that we're seeing even this limited relief is really a victory for the activists who've been working on this for years and struggling over it, and a proof of concept, which is to say, look, they can't say they can't do this anymore. They obviously can do it. They're doing it. And from our perspective, we need to bring that to the rest of student debt, and we need to bring that to a bunch of other debt too. We need to bring that to medical debt. We need to bring that to housing debt. We need to bring that to criminal legal debt. All of these types of debt are unjust. They're imposed on people because those people don't have the means to live, and they have to go into debt just to live their lives. And it's time for some action.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that too. And one of the things I've always appreciated about the Debt Collective and how you all have approached this is also sort of, the socializing of struggle, if you will, and the impact that debtors as a united force really have. And I was hoping you could speak to that, because I think a big part of debt, which is so tied to shame, is how individualized everyone is about it. You don't want to talk about it. You don't want to admit it. But most of us are suffering from it.
Yeah, absolutely. one of our favorite little quotes, which was, I think, originally from J. Paul Getty, right, is if you owe the bank $100,000, the bank owns you. If you owe the bank $100 million, you own the bank. And so individually, our creditors essentially own us. We're powerless against them as individuals. But collectively, all together, we are their entire existence. We are all of their assets, and we can actually exert a lot of control. So that's the idea behind the debt collective, behind having a union of debtors, is that even though we don't have much power as individuals, we have a great deal of power collectively that we can exert. So yes, that's the idea behind the debt collectives organizing. That looks different in different contexts. Sometimes it looks like shifting the narrative and changing people's ideas about things, like on federal student debt. Other times it might look like exerting some direct pressure and hitting an entity in its pocketbooks, whether that's people who owe money to a certain hospital coming together and taking action, or to a certain company, to a certain debt buyer. All of these things are sort of the possibilities of organized collective action on behalf of debtors that structurally look very similar to what you'd see when you're looking at labor unions, or when you're looking at tenants unions. These are all situations where people, if they come together, can exert a lot more power. I'm glad you raised the shame point, because I think that is one of the big obstacles. And one of our favorite activities to do are debtors' assemblies, where we get folks together and just talk about our debt and talk about the way that it's affected us. We had one of these, I think last week. It really stuck with me because a woman who was there, she had been in student debt for decades. And this was her second debtors' assembly. And she said after the first debtors' assembly that she went to, she actually went and told her sister that she had student debt for the first time. And her sister told her for the first time that she also had student debt. And, they'd both been struggling with this privately for decades and didn't even know it about each other. So it really is, it's powerful. It can be a weight lifted for people. And then once you lift the weight and come together, then we can start flexing some power.
And on that like related note, what can people who are watching do? Because obviously this isn't enough, right? This is this sort of like one-time forgiveness for a lot of people, but not everyone. And then it doesn't do anything about the fact that this student loan issue is going to continue for the foreseeable future, because people today are still taking out student loans. So obviously the activism around this is not anywhere near to complete. So where would you recommend people go? What should people do if they want to get involved on this issue?
Yeah, so folks should go to debtcollective.org and join the union, first of all. If you're able to pay dues, you can pay dues. If you're not able to pay dues, you don't have to pay dues. You can join the union, join our member Slack, come to a new members meeting, come to a debtors assembly, get involved. This is a people power movement. This isn't some, we're doing our best not to be brains in the cloud sort of directing this stuff, but we need ideas and we need energy from folks who are in debt. And it is a very fun and energizing space. So I would love for anyone listening who's interested to come join us, come to a meeting, come check it out. And then I would also say, just to your point about the fact that federal student debt is going to continue to be a problem, one of the things that I've been really disturbed by is the industry of private student debt refinancing. And these companies like SoFi and Laurel Spring and these other companies that will tell you, you should refinance out of your federal student debt because we'll give you a better interest rate and you'll money. That is a very, very limited view of what it means to be in student debt. And what folks do when they refinance is they essentially hand over their political leverage and no longer are able to benefit from any of the political action that they can collectively force from the federal government on federal student debt. And so I would also encourage people just to be thoughtful about that, and to recognize that you do have some power as a federal student debtor to exercise leverage against your creditor. It looks very different. It's not to say you don't have power to exercise leverage against SoFi, but that's different, and it might be hard to exercise.
Mm-hmm. Debtcollective.org, that's the site. Go there. Sparky Abraham from the Debt Collective, really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. No, it was an honor to have you here, and Great
That was actually really
organization. I guess
helpful.
in the spirit of full disclosure here, since they're saying you shouldn't do it, I actually many years ago went to an event where some debt collective organizers spoke and decided to default on one of my student loans rather than pay with other people there in the meeting. And I have to say, there is a liberating factor to collective action of all kinds. But yeah, when you realize there's other people who are willing to take on these big banks and these, I don't know, people say you shouldn't moralize, but evil people. I'm sorry, that's how I feel about them. It's there. So anyway, shout out to them, and I think it's a super important struggle, and that's why we are here where we are, where Biden is doing something, even if it's not enough, because there's been such an outcry. But I don't want to editorialize too much here. That'll bring us to the end of our show, as always, Rania. It's always somewhat of a sad time, for you and I, since we're separated by many thousands of miles. But that being said, it was a great show, as always. What can people do to support us, Rania?
They can donate below on YouTube, hit the donation button and throw in however much you want. That's always one way. Another way to donate more regularly is to become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And becoming a patron's good because every once in a while you might get a special perk. Keep your eyes open for that. And then, of course, you can also make a one-time donation by going to our website, breakthroughnews.org. There's ways to do it there. And also, if you don't have the money, you can share, subscribe, tell your friends about us, as Eugene always says, send a carrier pigeon if you have to. Lots of ways to support our show. And, we really could use the support considering that none of my loans are actually going to be able to be. I just learned that from our interview that none of my loans qualify.
Yeah. Well, there you go. We'll have to keep fighting and struggling. If you know how to train carrier pigeons, by the way, email us at info@breakthroughnews.org. It's hard to find a carrier pigeon trainer. I looked into that.
So into carrier pigeons.
It's important. You never know what's going to happen. Send a raven. Anyway, long story short, that's the end of this show. Shout out, of course, to everyone on the BT News team who helped make it possible. And we will see you next week.